This is a video on institutionalists. Among institutionalists, we'll talk about Veblen, John Commons, and W.B. Du Bois. So the institutionalists overlap pretty considerably with the Austrian school in the sense that it focuses on individual behavior. But the institutionalists are going to perhaps take it a step further and consider how institutions impact individual behavior and the circumstances under which individuals are making decisions. So we have two types of institutions. We have formal institutions, which would include anything written or tangible, laws, contracts, government regulations. And then we have informal institutions, which are much harder to measure, like culture, morality, and ethics. The institutional theory, many consider the birthplace of the study of law and economics. I know we have a law and economics class here. So that starts, I think, kind of in the early to mid 1900s. And the general theory of the institutionalists, again, is just that the costs and benefits associated with exchange or decision-making at the individual level may depend place to place, individual to individual, and will be a product of institutional factors. The institutionalists also focus on what we call collective action, which is collaboration of two or more individuals in pursuit of a common goal. And think of an institution as collective action and control, liberation and expansion of individual action. We see this even more when we get into some of our later modules on game theory. Those who have seen some game theory before know that game theory is a decision when you have two or more individuals whose decisions will impact each other. So the first author that we'll talk about is Thorsten Veblen, and Veblen's work returns to analysis of class-based behavior, which we saw kind of more in the classical economics, rather than looking at the individual, but then ultimately considers how the individual decides on purchases. So, like Marx, Veblen observed that there were a small group of capitalists or leisure class which controlled the majority of means of production. We had this ownership class that is similar to the bourgeoisie in Marx, but Veblen believed that instead of revolting against the ownership class, the working class would emulate them. So by emulation, what we mean is purchasing or doing things for the sole sake of displaying wealth. And this concept is known as conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption, purchasing just for the sake of displaying wealth. Veblen essentially believed that as people became more wealthy, they wanted to fit into this sort of leisure class, and so they would go at length to do things to distinguish themselves as being of a different class than the working class. We also have this similar idea of conspicuous leisure, which is simply for the sake of displaying wealth. So a couple examples we had from class, conspicuous consumption. There's a clothing brand called Supreme. It's very expensive and limited in supply, but it's just kind of normal clothes, and most people buy it to show that they're able to buy it. So it's sort of a status or wealth symbol. Conspicuous leisure. I know there's kind of a whole industry now of people who set up these photo shoots on jets or fancy hotels or things. You can rent it out for 30 minutes or an hour or whatever and take your pictures, so it looks like you're doing these expensive leisure activities. That might be an example of a conspicuous leisure. Right, so you're just doing something in order to display wealth or distinguish yourself from the leisure or into the leisure class. Distinguish yourself from the working class. So Marx, we know, believed that labor was irksome, and that was the problem, ultimately alienation. Veblen had a slightly different idea, also believed that work was irksome, but that man instinctively revolts at the effort that goes into the means of supply of life, And this irksomeness could be physical or spiritual, like Marx. But unlike Marx, Veblen believed that humans had this instinct for workmanship, which made the struggle for survival kind of our greatest strength. So Veblen says man's great advantage over the other species in the struggle for survival has been his superior facility in turning the forces of the environment to account, proclivity for the material means of life to account, that he owes his position as the Lord of creation. It's not to a proclivity to effort, but to achievement, to the encompassing of an end. So Veblen believed basically that we had transformed this struggle for survival into profit and improvement of standards of living. Right, so this kind of goes to show the institutionalists ultimately, as we'll see, especially into the modern era, maybe kind of post-Keynes. We'll talk a little bit more about Austrians and institutionalists, post-Keynesian theory in general. And what we see is that in the institutionalists, there begins to be this acknowledgement of the corporate world and sort of the power of the corporate world to produce and provide. So man's great advantage in other species is that all species are struggling for survival, but we had turned the struggle of survival into industry and profit and production, which ultimately was raising our standards of living above mere survival or subsistence for many people. You know, by the turn of the century here, 1898, 1900, we're starting to see some accumulation of wealth. Of course, still a very large working class that kind of subsides in the city and subsistence farming. Okay, another institutionalist, one that we would probably associate a little bit more with law and economics, is John Commons. So I posted a short reading on Commons, which I think kind of summarizes his views. But Commons believes that the economy is a web of relationships with people with diverging interests. So returning to a question which has we've seen pretty much throughout the literature, starting from the beginning, what is the role of government? You've got all these people with diverging interests, and the government is a mediator between groups with conflicting interests. Focusing on economic methods insufficient to explain the behavior of workers. So again, we have this institutional idea that culture, bargaining power, laws, and so on are needed, or we need to understand kind of the history and formation of these laws if we want to explain the behavior of workers or people today. Emphasis on legal foundations. And so ultimately economics cannot be separated from the political or social system and should be studied together with it. I don't think I would test on, this list of ideas here. These are some things that will come up, I believe, in that reading. But basically, the overarching idea here is that, in contrast to the Austrians, where we have this focus on methodological individualism, in Commons and the institutionalists, we need to study institutions. We need to study the role of, where are institutional factors here, laws, contract, government regulation, things that we can measure, but also things that we can't measure, culture, morality, ethics, perhaps religion would be on there as well. Okay, so can't be separated from our political social system. In other words, can't be separated from the institutions which go behind decision making. So we need to study them together. Along these lines, we have W.E.B. Du Bois, who pronounced his name in the American way, not in the French way. He's remembered more as the father of modern sociological studies, and especially African-American studies, but he also had a profound influence on the growth of the economic science. He himself was an economist trained in the German historical school. So in contrast to the Austrians, again, the institutionalists were looking a little bit more at groups again, but then ultimately focusing on how group behavior influences individual behavior, right? Generally, we see or are able to measure individual decision or individual outcomes at the end, but to the institutionalists, we need to focus on the role of institutions in creating those decisions and behavior. So the only true source of economic knowledge about human behavior is history and the formation of institutions. Dubois' studies were virtually unique in not treating African Americans as a population with innate and perhaps permanent individual failings. So in the previous units, we talked a little bit about these studies which appeared in kind of the post-slavery era, which defined difference as differences in innate and natural ability as stemming from race or gender. So in general, we might associate those studies with kind of like eugenics and that kind of quasi-scientific literature. And again, these types of studies which explain differences between, in particular for Dubois, Black and white employment outcomes, earnings at this time during the early 1900s, generally focused on differences in ability or differences in underlying characteristics that were functions of race. So if you're interested in this sort of literature, the kind of eugenics literature that popped up in the more recent literature, which has kind of argued against some of those theories that came out during the 1900s, I have a pretty good reading list from a former class that I took, and so feel free to get a hold of me about that. It would make a good paper topic, just kind of the change in economic thinking about difference and difference between races, difference between groups over time. It's really kind of notable to see how economists have changed their thinking away from treating certain groups, Black, Latin, women, and so on, as people who have innate and permanent individual failings, which explain differences in outcomes. Right, so ultimately Du Bois says that the world's thinking wrong about race. We don't know about it. The ultimate evil is stupidity, and the cure for it is knowledge based on scientific investigation. And so Du Bois is notable for conducting some of the first of what we would think about as maybe modern sociological studies. But for instance, his study on the Black population in Philadelphia is very notable, and in some sense an economic study. So what are these contributions to economics? Ultimately, all people of color, all people, are fully constituted persons who are capable of making fully informed decisions. And above that, everybody, Du Bois is focusing in particular on Black Americans, but to expand on that, people in general as decision makers are capable of knowing what their preferences and options are and maximizing their preferences. It's just that people face different constraints in what they can choose. So we need to emphasize the context and the environment within which groups seek opportunity, advancement, and ultimately make economic decisions. Right, so again, ultimately, Du Bois, I think, very much an institutional economics economist, because we're focusing here on individual decision, on behavior, but then we're looking at groups and how the environment within this group impacts decision. And, with the conception of what is behavioral maximization, or how do we maximize preferences. So ultimately in Du Bois, everybody is an optimizer and capable of optimizing, but people face different constraints for their optimization. And we need to note what these constraints are, especially within the historical context and how these constraints developed. Right, so we paved the way for some future sociological sciences, Africana, Latin, women's studies, which have really grown within the past 20 to 30 years. I know we have specific programs here at Colorado State outside of the economics department. I think we do have an Africana studies program, Latin studies, and so on. Du Bois, however, unlike some of these sociological sciences which have popped up stress, and I guess in contrast to the Austrians, stressed a rigid empiricism and says, until he has prepared the ground by intelligent and discriminating research, the labors of the philanthropist and statesman must continue to be, to a large extent, barren and unfruitful. So Du Bois, a lot of his work did focus on trying to take statistics and compare numerically. All right, so to contrast this sort of institutional thought from the Austrians, who did not generally use as much numbers and symbols, Du Bois, the institutionalists, generally do focus, especially kind of the later institutionalists. We'll probably reference Galbraith after Keynes. They're a little bit more mathematical than the Austrians. Right, both Austrians and institutionalists focus on individual behavior. Institutionalists focus on the circumstances under which individuals make decisions and how what we call institutions alter those circumstances.